Excellent. Just give me a second to today's set of controls. So the title I was given, Are Digital or Mobile Driving Licenses Paving the Way to Digital ID? Which kind of begs the question of what's a digital ID? So what I'm going to try and cover today is a bit of background about Cantera. I'll just race through those slides. Laura, are the slides being made available to the registrants? Are the decks being made available? Okay. So good. Some of these are for reference later, so I'll sort of race through them. We'll talk about an ISO standard that's just been published around mobile driving licenses, the W3C standard, verifiable credentials, a little bit on self-sovereign identity, and then what I think is the way forward, which is privacy-enhancing mobile credentials, and I'll get to why that is the case shortly. So about Cantera, it's a global consortium that works in the identity space. One of the things that we do is to provide assurance standards for levels of identity so that organizations can provide proof to their stakeholders about identity assurance. I only have 20 minutes, so that's why I asked if you have the deck. If you want to find out more about Cantera, please go to our website. We have a lot of organizations and members, and what I do for day-to-day is I run a boutique consultancy on privacy and identity. What I do for Cantera is I've been working with Cantera in a number of work groups and discussion groups. We've just published a report on privacy and identity considerations in mobile driving licenses, which is available for download. Now we can get into the what I want to talk about. So I'm assuming that people in the room and people online have heard about mobile driving licenses and may be aware that there's an ISO standard. And in the ISO standard, 18013-5, which is about the actual mobile driving license on the app, they present this diagram, which people in the audience or in the space will see the familiar triangle, which can be described in varying ways. In 18013-5, we have an issuing authority, which is a motor vehicle agency or a national licensing issuing authority, the government entity that collects your information and issues you with a driving license. The verifier, or the MDL reader, software or hardware to read the MDL, and of course the MDL holder, which is the mobile phone or the device that holds that. What's interesting, if we'll see what's in scope, using a machine to read the data, tie the MDL itself to a holder, authenticate the origin of the MDL, and verify, stuff that we've all talked about. But the following items are specifically out of scope in the ISO. How user consent to share data is obtained, and requirements on storage. And I'll focus more on why we need to extend what 18013-5 is, because that's kind of important for privacy, how user consent or user engagement is obtained. The MDL transaction flow is, and the first time I looked at it, there is an implied consent, because the only way an ISO compliant driver's license can be presented is if the user, barring a gun being put to their head, has to choose to present the MDL to the person asking for the attributes that are on the MDL. So there's an implied consent there. Once that happens, there's the device engagement, which may or may not involve a retrieval of a token from the issuing authority, and then the actual data retrieval where the reader gets the data and then uses the data. So the The joke, and this is probably an old one you've all heard before, is that driving licenses are used much more often for drinking than they are for driving, because the most common use is to add proof of age verification at a bar or at a liquor store, and since I'm Canadian, at a cannabis store. I'm so resentful I couldn't take an edible with me on the flight. Anyway, so that's a familiar flow that we're all seeing for. But what 18013-5 has an Annex E, privacy recommendations, but they're informative. And in the standards world, informative means you don't have to do it. It's not normative, it's not required, you don't have to do it. So from a variety of sources, they have a series of privacy recommendations, but there's nothing requiring an implementer in any side of that triangle to pay any attention to those privacy recommendations and still be compliant with the standard. So moving on, how many people have seen this diagram or a variety of it? The verified credentials. This is the W3C 1.1 data model of the verified credentials. So you'll see the same three main actors. You've got an issuer who issues a credential, a holder, in this case me, that acquires, stores, or present the credentials, and a verifier. Again, the bouncer at the club that wants to see if I'm 19 and old enough to enter the club. What is adds that isn't in the 18013-5 is the verifiable data registry, where there's a source of trust. And moving quickly, because I have 20 minutes, the self-sovereign identity stack, this is from Phil Windley's blog. So you can see here, you've got governance frameworks on the top. So an example of that is Sovereign, I think who they're on stage in the panel discussion next. You've got the credential exchange, which is that trio of players that we've talked about in the prior instances. DIDCOM, which is the new protocol for accepting credentials and receiving proofs using DIDs, decentralized identifiers, which then may be used on some public or private blockchain for validation and storage. And if you talk to self-sovereign people, it's not self-sovereign if you don't have choice, if you don't have digital identity, and if there isn't some kind of DLT or digital ledger technology at the root of it. So that's sort of the background and overview of the various standards areas or reference architectures for that MDLs and verified credentials play in. So just pause for a second. I don't know, any questions online or comments, Laura? Anybody in the room? Sorry about that. Oh, so I take that to be a yes, so I'll pause for a second.
There was a question of how much this all relies on the need for blockchain with its trust properties to be used more in the ecosystem to kind of reach consensus around governance and make sure that responsibility is linked back to trust. I think that they're asking. So how important is the blockchain and other distributed ledger technologies to this kind of model?
For the self-sovereign model, that's kind of integral. Mm-hmm. But at a slightly higher level of abstraction, what the blockchain represents is a common source of truth that's accessible to the people in the area. So if you take out the blockchain, but you use just DIDs, because DIDs are based on PKI and a cryptographic infrastructure. If it's a two-party exchange, and a lot of personal information is Alice to Bob, so you can use signed versions of whatever those transactions are, and since both parties get those signed transactions, you can have levels of trust and governance without a blockchain. It's a different architecture, but it's still possible. Anybody in the room?
Any questions?
All right. So, that was actually a good lead-in question to this diagram, which is from the report that Cantera just approved. Do I have a laser on this thing? No. So on the left, you see the issuing authority, the MDL holder, and the MDL verifier in the context of 18013-5, and the numbered data flows are the interfaces in 18013-5. On the right, you see the identity provider, the individual, and the relying party, which are the three parties in the verified credentials, or also and that layer 2 of the self-sovereign identity, and all the way over to the right, sort of grayed out because it didn't really play into the Cantera report, is the DLT that stores the attributes. So here's the future. Seamless, frictionless interoperability, irrespective of who issued the credential, so that I can choose to present that credential to a verifier, and there'll be enough information on that credential so that the verifier can say yes or no, we'll accept this transaction, right? And so you can't do that just with the MDL, because if you remember at the scope of the MDL, they talk about being able to be read by other entities. You can't necessarily do it with a single verified credential, because the data structure is defined in the W3 standard, but interoperability, not necessarily the same. And if you're using blockchain, if you're using Ethereum for one set of transactions and Ethereum for another, Stellar for a third, and they're all public blockchains, do they necessarily talk to each other? So you have to have a way for the data flow between these various entities, and that's what we started to talk about in the report. And that's so 1, 2, and 3 are the interfaces in 18013-5. The grayed out dotted areas are all the theoretically possible data flows, but the other ones that we thought would make interoperability, the one labeled A, because if you see on the right-hand side, there's the individual with a mobile device, a verified credential, and on the left is the MDL with the attributes. The individual or the MDL holder, at the end of the day, is a single person. That's the same person. They may be holding a single wallet that has both the MDL and other credentials, or they may have 2 wallets on their device. My phone currently has 8 things that are labeled as wallets, which is really irritating. And can they talk to each other? Like, the MDL should be a reliable source of identity attributes to other applications that play nicely on my device. It's not necessarily the case. There's also a similar set of relationships between the MDL verifier and the relying party. That may well be the same bar or the same state trooper that's asking for my device. And so what's that verifier? And then finally, outside of the 18013-5, but still in the verified credentials world, there's the data flow C between the mobile device and the relying party. And one of the things we make a point of in the report is flash passes are a bad thing, right? The people have spent, entities and governments have spent a lot of money producing that little piece of plastic in your pocket with all kinds of features that make it hard to counterfeit and make people, oh, that's a real province of Ontario, UK, French driving license. Taking a picture of that and storing it in a format that anybody in their basement then can use graphic software to manipulate, not a good idea. All right, so how do we replicate in the digital realm the same anti-counterfeiting, trust-verifying characteristics? Which is why the new work group is privacy-enhancing mobile credentials. And ignore all the words. At the end of the day, well, read them later. Don't ignore them. At the end of the day, when you look at 18013-5 or the W3C, these are transactional and by and large transactional and technical methods to ensure that when Alice and Bob, the old Alice and Bob story, that transaction is secure and private and trustable. But I don't trust the transaction as a citizen or a consumer. I trust the entity. So how do I know that once the bar or the state trooper or whoever, the verifying identity, how do I know that they're only, and here's my definition of privacy, sort of the operational density. Privacy is the ability of the individual to choose what it is they disclose to someone else, and to know that the terms under which they choose it, I share information with my wife. I know that that's probably going to be kept relatively close. I share other information with a circle of friends. I share other information commercially. My privacy is maintained to the extent that the implicit or explicit terms of which I disclose that information are maintained by the party or the parties to whom I disclose it. That's got nothing to do with the transactional security and everything to do with, can I trust that entity, that state institution, that bar? And that's what the privacy enhancing mobile credentials is trying to produce, a set of conformance standards so that you can make assertions that come to my bar, we'll collect the information, we'll only use it for the purposes of age verification and nothing else. Come to this arena, like the sport, come to this event. And I had to install an app on my phone to come to this event, and they've collected a certain amount of information. How do I know, and I trust you, Laura, really I do, but how do I know that VC Innovations isn't harvesting that information and doing other things with it that I may or may not have been aware of had I read all the terms and all the purposes? So what we're trying to do, and some of the bigger entities are already part of the working group, is to produce a set of conformance standards so that if you want to make assertions that you can trust me as an entity, not just the transaction, then we've got a way forward, and then we've also got a road towards interoperability so that maybe, and one day, I'll only have 1 or 2 wallets on my phone instead of 8. Anyway, time, because this is what we don't want to end up with. You know, I'm an old guy, VHS beta. VHS was technically inferior, but it won the war. We don't want technically inferior identity solutions winning the full war because it's first or easiest. We want, what's the saying? I have a neighbor to the south of me called the US, and there's a saying, the US always does the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else first. And I don't want the identity world to be the same thing, right? Let's try all these other identity solutions because I want to be the single global identity provider, or I want to be the next unicorn in identity, or right? From the point of view of the consumers and the citizens, I should be able to choose my application or my wallet just as easily as I pick this wallet up on vacation in Northern Ontario. So technical superiority can lose to a variety of factors, whether it's first mover, market dominance, resistance to change. So if we're going to have an interoperable, easy to use, frictionless, and trusted identity system around mobile device credentials, we need to get together and determine how are we going to build privacy enhancing credentials in a way that people can trust so we can still compete with each other for that market, but grow the pie and come up with a more successful ability for individuals to feel in control of their own identities at the end of the day. So please, if you do download this or go to the Cantera site, you can join the work group because we're actively recruiting people in industry and in the space to help define what those conformance standards are going to be like. I think I'm on time.
Absolutely. First of all, any questions from anyone in the room? So there's a few from online, so. Right, I'll just come up.
Come on up.
So there's a couple that have come through online. I think what this one is asking about is kind of the readiness, John, of users to adopt this whole thing. So from the sort of the layout and the diagrams you shared, it's quite complex, that map of where the data is going. To what extent do you think the end user will kind of be able to understand that enough to kind of take that control of their own data, if you know what I mean? Is that something that they're ready for?
I think that's a great question. And I think the first wallet muggles will have, because in this room, hands up how many's got more than one wallet on their phone already, right? Right? So we're probably not a normal sample.
Yeah, exactly.
But when, I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, God help me. When I want to go to a Cleveland Browns game and I'm told I can bring all this stuff, or I can bring my phone, or my driving license, when there's a government-issued version of an identity document, that's going to be mass adoption. And there's already some states and governments that are doing it in a way that isn't compliant with what we've just talked about. That's why I'm worried about VHS.
Yes.
Right? But if you get a driving license, which is probably going to be the first mobile identity that most people have, if it's interoperable, people already have it, right? So that's where government says, you will use this thing, gets us to the first mover advantage. And we want to be able to use and leverage that to provide a better experience for citizens and users. I don't know if that was responsive.
No, I think so, definitely. Another person asked, do we necessarily see a distributed ledger technology underpinning this architecture, or do we also see other trusted IDP? And they said, albeit that may be centralized sources, but maybe that would kind of defeat the...
I think that's probably deep in the land of the user doesn't give a crap, right? That's why I harped on about interoperability, right? Some of them, and I think I'm on stage next to, like, the people from the Sovereign Foundation, people from Disrupt, there's other initiatives will say that DLT or some form of it is essential, and it makes sense in their ecosystem, and it may well be appropriate, as long as it's interoperable, as the various entities can, behind the scenes or in a way that makes sure that the user has trust, can move the attributes between the various systems, then I don't think it matters. If somebody says, it must be this way, that's going to be the problem.
John, just following up.
Oh.
Sure.
Just following up on, is the issue the use case though? So following up on like digital mobile driving license,
Right.
Is a credential that might be suitable or useful for various use cases,
Right.
but not for others.
That's correct.
Things like security,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. So that question about the layers and the sort of trusted organizations or processes that ensure the integrity of the identity depend very much on the use case, not simply on the standard or the technology.
So here's a use case I have to do. I think that's absolutely. Here's a use case that I have to do every day I go to the gym. I took my Ontario QR code credential and I could put it on my app, but what happens is if you go to the gym, I also have to scan my gym membership, and because this says he's certified, I have to provide my driving license. So I thought I could bring up my phone and I see people swipe, swipe, swipe. That's not an easy experience. This turns out to be relatively easy. I bring out all three pieces and I just can scan them all at the same time. This is the least and I did a blog post about this. This is the least friction way that I can figure out how to do this. And that's not frictionless, right? So each one of these is a separate, and for good reason, set of attributes in a different back-end system. The only place these should be unified is in my wallet, and I should be able to present that digitally and choose which one of these attributes goes through, right? So I don't know if that...
Any more from the
And if you took screenshots of my driver's license or the QR code or...
One further one from online.
Sure.
The MDL, do you see that as being quite a North American-centric framework that you've outlined, or is that something that could be expanded for use cases globally? Or maybe would it be kind of a different credential, perhaps, but based on the same sort of structure?
Well, since it's an ISO standard, 18013-5, there is reasonably good European contribution to that. It's a good, clear, well-defined technical standard. 18013-5 is designed for in-person presentation, what they call day one. -7 is the one that's going to be for online presentation, and I think when that one, which is probably published next year, provides sort of an online verification, because it's an ISO standard, because it's first mover, and because American states are starting to use it, I think it's going to be a de facto standard for MDL. There may be variations, but I think there'll be that ability for interoperability. I don't know if I hope that answers the question.
No, absolutely. Fantastic, thank you, John. And you know, we're kind of carrying on with a similar line of discussion in the next session, anyway. So you know, some more questions might crop up along these sorts of issues. But
applause
thank
to
you very
Laura.
much.
She's been a phenomenon in organizing this.
Applause for John, I think.